transform learning and help leaders use virtual learning to drive real change. Now, as I quickly share some housekeeping notes, drop in the chat or comments box on social where you're joining in from today. We are recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is also going to include a survey for feedback, as well as a number of resources that are aligned with today's conversation. We suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, quitting out of your email and messaging apps so you can really get the most out of the conversation today. And it's also going to help with your audio and video quality. And lastly, we love interaction, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments with us in the chat. Now, to get this show underway, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. An Aussie turned New Yorker who coined the term neuroleadership when he co-founded NLI over 2 decades ago. With a professional doctorate, 4 successful books under his name, and a multitude of bylines ranging from the Harvard Business Review to the New York Times and many more, a warm welcome to the co-founder and CEO of the Neuroleadership Institute, Dr. David Rock. Thanks for being here today, David.
Thanks, Shelby. Thanks for everything you do to get this going. Exciting topic today.
Yes. And our moderator for today leads the research team at the Neuroleadership Institute, where she focuses on translating cognitive and social neuroscience into actionable solutions for organizations, as well as helps to communicate relevant research in an accessible manner for the public. Previously, she was a professor at Dominican College and New York University and a researcher at the Nathan Klein Institute. She holds a bachelor's degree from Brown University and a PhD in neuroscience from New York University. A warm welcome to the Senior Director of Research at NLI, Dr. Emma Saro. Thanks for being here today, Emma, and I'm passing it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, David. How's it going today?
Good to be back here with you. I should let out a secret. Really, we run these so that you and I get a chance to catch up on really interesting, important things. It gives us a chance to really dig deep into stuff. So great to see you again and have a good conversation.
Yeah, this is where we cover our favorite topics, right? So today it is an exciting topic. We're talking about virtual learning and doing so in a way that produces real sustainable habits. A few reasons why this matters a lot more now than maybe ever before is the skill half-life, for one, is shrinking. More skills are needed at a more rapid pace. Leadership development in particular is in need of something that is effective and succinct. Leaders are not getting any less busy, and the problems they're facing are even more challenging. And the hybrid workplace is absolutely a mainstay, meaning that people are really less likely to show up for in-person trainings. So for anyone who knows us, we've been building habits and transforming organizations for over 26 years, and doing so by providing a wide range of solution formats, short videos to our newest habit activation platform, if you heard us talking about this, which is really a mix of digital learning and social engagement. But to date, the most impactful delivery format we have, measured by the percentage of people building sustainable habits, happens to not be workshops in person, but this unique form of virtual learning. And we call this the HIVE, High Impact Virtual Experience. So that's what we're talking about today. So tell us, David, how do you define virtual learning versus something like e-learning, in person, or other forms of learning?
Yeah, I think it's good to start with some definitions. So companies have all these different sort of definitions of this stuff. I mean, I think the variable that matters is it instructor-led or is it asynchronous, right? So is there a time that people come together with an instructor, right? Or are people going and doing their own learning? Or it could be a bit of both, right? But a Hive is an instructor-led experience. And the second question is sort of, how big is the cohort? Is it 4 people? Is it 20 people? Is it 100 people? Is it 10,000 people, right? And for us, as a Hive has a specific size. So, it's instructor-led. It's around 20 to 30 people, no more than 30. And the other thing that's really important is it's over time. It's an experience over time, right? With that same group of people, right? So it's an instructor-led experience, over time with the same people, but at a small enough number of people you can really learn together. And it's really interesting just how much of a kind of community you can build even in just 3 sessions. And how important that sense of community is for the real learning. So there's a whole lot of non-obvious benefits to this kind of learning. And the title of the session was kind of the right and wrong way to do virtual learning. And a lot of what we've done with Hives can be really applied to any kind of virtual learning that you're doing. So we're going to dig into the science of it. It sounds like we're just trying to sell you a Hive, but it's really the principles of this we think are really important for any kind of virtual learning. And it's one of those things that if you get right can actually be much, much more effective in terms of really changing people than in person. Putting aside radically cheaper, radically faster, radically easier, right? It's actually much more effective when you get this right. So it's a really amazing promise that instead of trying to bring, 1,000 people into a classroom, which would cost you, $1 million before you blink, and take you, 2 years, and you never get more than 80% there, right? You can put 1,000 people into virtual learning in 3 months and get 95% of them involved for, maybe 100,000. And it would be better than this huge team trying to get everyone in person. It would actually be better for behavior change than if you did the workshop. So that's an incredible promise. So we think it's really, really important. If this stuff can be like 10% of the cost and actually better, in a world of shrinking budgets and dispersed teams, it's pretty important to get this stuff right. But there's 1,000 ways to get it wrong, and a few ways to get it right. So that's why we think this is an important topic, particularly dispersed teams, more learning than ever, and tightened budgets. Those 3 reasons make it really important to kind of work on this promise.
Yeah, absolutely. And how would you then differentiate this from something like e-learning? What's the difference?
Yeah, so this is the sort of the synchronous, the cohort issue. Like so mostly e-learning is not synchronous. There might be an instructor involved, but it's asynchronous. You're doing it on your own.
Mm-hmm.
You're not getting the social learning, and there's just this huge difference in the quality of attention. And so you need very focused attention, and we'll come back to this. But think about like an all hands meeting that your company runs with, say, a couple hundred people, and you're there live. Maybe you're even off camera, right? But you're there live. You're actually paying a lot more attention than if you're watching and recording. It's the same experience. It's the same content. Why is that? Right? Why is it you pay so much more attention? Because it's live, right? So there's something in our brain about the social, kind of being in a social construct makes us pay a lot more attention. So e-learning is sort of is very individually focused. You don't get as much of the social learning. Often it's not over time. It's this one-off experience. So you're not getting a very strong attention, and you're not getting very high, what we call generation, which is kind of making connections. You also don't have very high emotions involved. Now you may or may not have spacing. You can have spacing with e-learning, but essentially you're not getting 3 of the 4 things that really matter in enough kind of dosage, which is close attention, really good generation of connections, and really good emotional content. So e-learning is great for cost, scale, and speed, but not good for actually embedding learning in that way.
Yeah, right. And we talk a lot about embedding real habits, right? So that's the point. You want those behaviors to last for months or years after the session, so you don't have to repeat it. So you mentioned this idea of like being very intentional about putting the right science-based pieces into the learning. So what are those 3 conditions of habits, right? We're building habits. What are those 3 pieces that we added into the Hives?
Well, there's kind of 2 elements of science that I think are really helpful to understand around virtual learning. There's sort of 2 foundational frameworks, and they kind of build on each other. The first framework to understand, I started to kind of touch on it, and if you know our work, you've heard this from us because we published it in 2010 the first time, 14 years ago. But it's the AGES model, which is essentially the 4 conditions that have to be high. Well, to be honest, they have to be moderate to high, but at least moderate for real embedding. And we look at real embedding, meaning the definition for us is easy recall under pressure. So if you're trying to help someone be more inclusive as a leader, they have to remember what they're supposed to do easily under pressure, right? As they're walking into a meeting where there's a whole lot of conflict, they've got to easily remember what they're supposed to do. Not it be this complex model that takes like, a minute to remember. So anyway, so easy recall under pressure requires moderate to high amounts of AGES, and I'll explain AGES, and none of them can be low. All 4 of them have to be high to get this embedding, right? It's attention, which is literally focusing, right? Generation, which is making connections, emotions, which is, emotions, right? They actually have to be pretty high, because if you don't feel something about what you're learning positively or negatively, the brain just says it doesn't matter. It doesn't get tagged. The hippocampus, which is responsible for creating memory networks, it doesn't store memories, but it kind of creates the network. The hippocampus and the amygdala are neighbors. They're really one system in a way, right? So the amygdala is the the valence detector of emotions, like positive or negative, and the hippocampus is the memory center. So if the amygdala is quiet, there's no emotion, and the hippocampus just doesn't sort of say this map really matters in a way. It's very untechnical. But so anyway, you need strong emotions. And then you also need the spacing, because we don't store memories. We grow them, and we actually grow them back to attention. We grow them with the effort of attention, and the coming back to things in different contexts really helps to grow. So you need really high ages. And it turns out that with a hive, or anything similar to a hive, you can actually get really high ages. You can get really high attention and generation and emotion and spacing in ways that you actually can't do in in-person workshops. Even the spacing, it's interesting. You could in theory get spacing in in-person workshops, but if you could design, like, let's say 4 1-hour in-person experiences that were just an hour and every week for a month, you would probably do better than a hive. If you could design 4 1-hour experiences, you could probably, and they were in the morning, you could probably actually create more impact. But very, very, very few situations allow that, right? Very few companies will say, oh, let's get you all together every week, every Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock for an hour, we're going to do this learning module. That will be much better than what we can do with a hive. But actually a hive will be a pretty close second. Attention, generation, emotion, spacing. So that's a really foundational thing. So with e-learning, attention's not great, generation's not great, emotion's terrible, spacing is great, and cost is great, right? Very low cost and scale, right? And speed, right? But with a hive, you actually can get very close attention, very, very good enough generation, moderate to high generation, moderate to high, actually pretty high emotion. Sometimes the emotions are stronger than in person. And you definitely can get the spacing, and you can get the cost. So I'll walk through the model briefly once more, and maybe my team can put a link to a reading when I finish, so you can kind of dig in after. But we published a paper originally in 2010 on this, and it's essentially the summary of what makes the hippocampus really activate during an encoding task. And so you need quite close attention, the kind of attention you pay. If I said, hey, Bogdan, come off camera, you don't have to do it. But if I said to Bogdan, come off camera, he's on our team, come off camera, and I want you to tell me right now what we just discussed, Bogdan's attention would go whoop, right? And he'd be like, wow, right? And he would be really paying attention, especially if I said, oh, I'm going to give you another 30 seconds to think about it, and I'm going to repeat what I just asked you and give you a moment to collect yourself. But everyone else's attention would go also really up, especially if I said, I'm going to call on 2 other people after Bogdan to do the same thing, right? I'm going to get you to really share. So attention is like that really intense, focused attention. That's actually what you need. Generation it's about generating connections to existing schemas. So a schema is basically another word for a map, right? It's the description of how all information holds together in the brain. Everything's in schemas. So generation is as an adult, you're not laying down many new schemas. What you're doing is you get new information, you've got to connect it to existing information, right? If someone says, hey, as a leader now, we want you to speak last when people, have a tough question in your meeting, right? To be more inclusive, speak last. You've got to make sense of that. Like, how does that fit, right? It doesn't feel right. How do I fit that, right? And the moment where you fit that, when you connect it to existing knowledge, often that's an insight moment, right? We've been talking a lot about insight. We did a whole session on it last week, one of my favorite topics. So the strongest form of generation actually is insight, right? So generation is about connections, the aha moment, exactly. Emotions, interesting. So it's much easier to create strong negative emotions than strong positive emotions. Really, really easy. All I have to do is tell all of you right now that I'm going to call on you and ask you to put something in the chat. If I just said to you, hey, 192 people, I'm going to randomly pick 10 of you, call out your name, and you have to put something in the chat to summarize everything we've said so far, your brain's going to go pretty haywire on emotions. You're going to be like, some of you will be overwhelmed and say, you didn't have permission to do that. You don't have my consent. Others of you are going to say, wow, that's really intense, but I'm going to do it. So it's very easy to create strong emotions in the moment on virtual learning. Much harder to create strong positive emotions. But you actually need pretty strong emotions. And it turns out virtually you can do it. Now, if everyone's off camera, everyone's muted, you're not going to create emotions. So there's a few things that are necessary to do it. Anyway, the spacing is interesting. Spacing, the longer you space between learning intervals, the longer people remember things. So if you've got a 3-hour class, you're actually better to do 1 hour every month for 3 months. But no one wants to do that. So we end up doing 1 hour every week for 3 weeks. So AGES stands for attention, generation, emotion, and spacing. And so what we see is that in virtual learning, you can actually maximize those really better than in-person learning, much better, and much better than e-learning. Although we've designed a form of e-learning now, which we've designed a whole kind of concept of e-learning, where we think you can actually do really well, like well enough with attention, generation, emotion, spacing, that we think we can beat in-person workshops with something that's asynchronous. And so we call that the habit activation platform. Maybe my team can put a link in there about the HAP. So we're starting to put all our solutions into this HAP. But today we're talking about synchronous, real-time. The fun thing with a Hive is like you can call us up and say, "Hey, David, we really want to do something about." I'm gonna choose a topic. Let's say safety, right? We've got 1,000 managers. They're all around the world. We want to meaningfully do something about safety, and we want to do it next month, and we don't have much budget. We can actually design 3 Hives, and we know that those 3 Hives, 3 1-hour sessions, are going to be significantly more effective than putting those, let's say, 1,000 people around the world into an in-person workshop, right? And that, again, we can do it all next month. So we can build and execute a Hive, high-impact virtual experience really fast on pretty much any topic, right? So, recently, there's been a lot of demand for accountability. So we're about to launch Hive on accountability, right? Like we're just about to publish a piece in HBR about the 3 foundations of accountability, the 3 cognitive frameworks. So we can move really quickly if we have the theory to building, executing, and rolling out a Hive. This is amazing for you guys. Like if you're in learning, you really understand how to build Hives, you can take any topic and scale real habit activation really fast. So anyway, attention, generation, emotion, spacing, that's one underpinning framework for learning. The second one, and I'll get back to you, I'm answering your questions and all the ones coming up in the chat all at the same time. So that's one framework. The other one is the conditions for habits. And we haven't turned this into a model, maybe we should, but it's the 3 conditions for habit activation at scale, particularly. And one of those is the creation of insight, of strong insight, right? We've got the Eureka scale to measure that. So if you've got 1,000 people, you want them to be better at safety, right? You need those 1,000 people to have a strong insight. But you also need that insight to be about one habit that they can go and apply that week, right? And that one habit at a time, over time. So the first condition is strong insight. The second condition is about one habit at a time, over time. And we think that 30 days is about the right unit of time. And then the third condition is in a social context, ideally in a social situation that matters. So in a social context, you pay more attention, right? You actually generate more connections, your emotions are higher, and you get some really interesting spacing effects. So insight and social both actually create high AGES. And apologies to people new to our work, I'm just speaking in jargon and gobbledygook right now, but AGES, attention, generation, emotion, spacing. So insight and social constructs basically activate the conditions that your brain needs to really recall things. So anyway, those are the 2 foundational models for designing learning. You want high AGES and you want strong insights, and you want them over time, and you want them socially. And when you design for those things, you can do really amazing things with Hives.
Yeah, no, this is great. I mean, you just covered basically the blueprint for creating a really impactful virtual learning session. I mean, as you said, we can do it pretty quickly. We have the formula. All we need are the concepts that we put into it. And it does seem like everyone is super interested in this topic. We're getting a ton of questions. So I think I'm just going to throw some questions over to you. Edwin asked about parallel processing. How do we incorporate that in our Hives, and how do we do it?
Yeah, so one of the really cool things actually about platforms, platforms like Zoom and Teams and all this stuff have some obvious downsides, right? Those are obvious, but there are upsides that are non-obvious. And if you've got kind of a fixed mindset about platforms and learning, all you see is the fact that you're not in the room together, and you wish you were in the room together, and all this stuff. But if you have a growth mindset about virtual platforms, you actually see these non-obvious things you can like leverage. One of the things that you can leverage is the fact that you can all be digitally in something, like in a chat, right? Or really cool in a Google Doc, in the same Google Doc, right, that you can be playing with. And you can do things on a platform you can't do in person, we call one of those things we call parallel processing, which is essentially if you're in a learning experience, you can like present an idea, and you can present that, maybe you present it and maybe you send a link and let people kind of move through a deck in their own time for a few minutes. But you present something and now you can ask everyone for their input in parallel, in a very specific way. You can basically say, hey, I want everyone to give me a number out of 10 with how well you understand this idea. Like 10 is you completely understand it. There's no questions. You completely get it. Like you live and breathe this idea already. 5 is you kind of half understand it. You can get a group of 20, 30 people, spend 5 minutes introducing an idea, and then immediately go, zoop, look at that. Look at the numbers, right? And go, look at that. We average around a 6. So we better do some work here. Now you can say, hey, everyone, I want you to put like 3 things that you want to know more about in the chat, from what we just presented. And you can go zoop, literally in 10 seconds, it comes in, you can see it, you can go, okay, we're going to focus here, right? You can also do this with meetings. We do this with meetings. And so, yeah, to Mary's point, it's actually more inclusive this way. It's ironically more inclusive and less biased because you're not just hearing the loudest voices. I learned this years ago. We learned this actually in a room. I was pitching to a large room of executives at a hospital chain, and it was like 30 people in the room, and we had like an hour and a half meeting to kind of share these ideas, and we'd allocate an hour to present and half an hour to debrief. And what happened was we sort of were presenting. For some reason, we took an hour and 25 minutes to present, and we had 5 minutes left. And sort of 2 people out of the 30 got to speak, and we just had no idea what people felt about what we'd shared, right? It was like, we don't know if people loved it, hated it, what their questions were, nothing. And I was like, wow, if only there was a way we could kind of gather high level data to guide where to dig in, right? Like, so anyway, we developed a whole process called parallel processing that you can use in virtual learning that's super helpful. Polls are okay. You need polls above a certain size. So if you've got like, 30 to 50 people, you can sort of manage the chat. You got, 50 to hundreds, a poll's going to be helpful. You just got to get good at the timing because you start to lose attention when you have these delays. So there's sort of one of the golden rules of a Hive is kind of holding attention, not leaving like 5 seconds of dead air that people can mentally wander off, which looks like checking their phone, right? So anyway, I digress. So a couple other questions, and then let's dig in more.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna come back to attention in a bit, but Courtney asked about the ideas of multitasking, kind of along the same lines of attention, while you're parallel processing. I mean, you're asking people to put ideas in, you're also talking at the same time, or how do we kind of manage that in a Hive?
Yeah, so let me answer that a different way. Hives can be amazing, but there's like 1,000 ways to mess them up, right? And I'll give you some of them. Like there's so many different ways it can go wrong. Like one of them is just like if you put 50 people in a Hive, it's just not going to work, right? Because basically people have attention, pay enough attention if they believe they're kind of like people are watching them, or they could be called on, right? Like if you're in a group of 4 and you're all on camera, you're not multitasking, right? In a group of 10, you're on camera, you're not multitasking. You're in a group of 20, you're on camera. Maybe you're multitasking, but not if the facilitator says, I'm going to call on you any minute, right? And so one of the factors is how many people. Another factor is like, are you on camera or not? It's hugely important. Another variable is, are you going to be called on or not, right? And we're getting more and more pushback from clients on this. They're like, oh, people are complaining that it's too intense, that the learning experience is too intense. We're like, yeah, that's the point. We need people to be focused. But we're like, people are like, wanting to chill and, do this and other, and we're like, no multitasking, right? Attention needs to be focused on one thing. And one of the dangers actually of virtual learning is actually multitasking with the chat. You don't want people having a whole long conversation in the chat while a facilitator is presenting, while things are happening on slides, right? You actually want to, like, in a learning experience, you actually want one focus, right? So they're focused on your words, or they're focused on the screen, or they're focused on the chat. You can jump it around, but so that's an interesting challenge. But anyway, it's got to be the right size. It's got to be on camera. You got to be calling on people. It's also the time of day, the time of the week. Like, don't schedule a Hive at 5 o'clock Friday, obviously. But there's a whole lot of ways it can go wrong. There's also some really interesting nuance in kind of the way that you kind of ask questions. There's a whole lot of really interesting nuance. So yeah, so a couple of interesting kind of directions there.
Yeah, no, we're getting so many great questions, but how about we just dive into how it was developed? Like, what was the
I think it's probably worth explaining that so we can sort of get into some of the questions. Let me explain this with a story. I remember when I was, it's going to sound like a complete digression, but I remember when I was like really young, like I had my, like I was maybe like 9 or 10 years old or something. I had my first girlfriend. We met in the snow. It was very romantic. And it's getting very personal now. And I remember she lived like in a long way away, right? And I remember we would meet each other once in a while. My parents were really nice. And we would meet each other once in a while. She had beautiful blonde hair, blue eyes. She was really gorgeous. And we were like, had this beautiful love affair. Maybe I was 11 or somewhere between 8 and 12. Anyway, we would meet. And when we were together, I was just like, could hardly say a word, right? But we'd get on the phone and we'd have these amazing, deep, long, real conversations. And we'd talk for hours. And this phenomena has been studied, not in that exact context, but this phenomenon has been studied that people are much more willing to be open and vulnerable and real without the social cues of the visual social cues, without being in person or on camera. And, sort of people are just much more honest and real on the phone. So those people, like, it's just like maybe those people who tried coaching have noticed that it's really weird, but coaching on the telephone is often much better than coaching in person. And I noticed this because 1998, right? I'd been coaching people for a couple of years already. I know I'm that old. I'd been coaching people for a couple of years, and I did a bit of coaching on the phone, and I was quite happy with that because at the time I lived like on the ocean and I could sit outside and literally look at the waves and coach. It was wonderful. But it was really interesting that you could coach on the phone and actually be better, right? And it was partially the absence of the social cues made people more open. Partially it was the efficiency, but I also just felt like direct into someone's ear was just even more intimate. And as the coach, you could hear the nuances in like the choice of words, tone of voice, when they paused, when the energy went up or down. Like you could hear so much rich data when you weren't distracted by seeing, right? When you weren't distracted by the visuals. And quite often when I was coaching, I'd be like closing my eyes and really sensing energy in the person's words. I ended up coaching a couple of thousand people in the early days. Anyway, long story short, we started to train coaches in 1998, and initially that was all in person. The first program where it was in Edgecliff in Sydney, and I've still got a photo of the first like 18 people we trained. And what I realized was that was incredibly inefficient to train, because it was kind of meeting every week for a year was insane as a business model. But I also realized like maybe we could do it on the phone. And so the first experiments we did were like, I wonder if we could kind of, go to, let's say, I lived in Sydney. I wonder if we could go to Melbourne and do a few days of the training and then do the rest in like small groups by phone. There was no like platforms back then. It was just kind of phone bridges and all this stuff. And what I found was that we could actually train really, really effectively, like certify coaches, like train people to be really powerful coaches by phone. And in fact, as we did this, we realized it was a really effective business model. We could fly in and do some training in person and then do the rest of the training by phone. And now we could build a global business. And being Australian and liking to travel, of course, that expanded, and suddenly we're in the States and we're in the UK and everywhere. So we just found it's really not just efficient, it's very efficient, but it's actually more effective in many ways. But if you went to 30, 40 people, it didn't work. There was a sweet spot. Interestingly, if it was like 12 or less, it wasn't that great. It was like 16 to 24 was a sweet spot. And so we started to take this concept of like really doing deep learning and kind of codifying all the different sort of skills that you need to do it, and then teaching facilitators how to do it. And then we thought, oh, we could put any content in this kind of format. And we started to put lots of different content into this format. And we found that the construct worked. And then we've tweaked. So we've probably run, I don't know, 1,000 different hives, maybe more in 26 years, but we've tweaked and tweaked the formula. But essentially, it sort of came from this insight that that you could actually get really personal, really deep, really quickly if you're not in person. And then that led us to experiment with these different formats and these different kind of ways, and then tweaking and tweaking. And actually, what we did at one point is we said, I wonder if it's possible to do the coach training with no in-person, just virtual. And we did 2 sessions a week, like a Monday and Thursday evening, for 12 weeks or something. And it was actually just as good, if not better, than any in-person at all. And it blew us away. So we, we've been sort of experimenting with this for a long time, and we just found you can, but it's not obvious, right? And again, I think one of the reasons it's not obvious is we're all used to these incredibly boring, Zoom calls where we're just really doing other things. And it really does take something to have people kind of really pay attention.
Yeah. No, I think with the stories that you're telling, everyone is paying attention, to be honest. I love the stories.
I think it's great. I have a PhD in TMI. So,
we're getting a lot of questions about, so I think you covered a lot on the structure, the format, like the blueprint for these, but we're getting a lot of questions about things like the optimal number of people, like why is it like optimal to be 20 to 30? And you talked a bit about this, but also like the number of hives. So you mentioned 3. So what is it about having 3? Is that just the content amount, or is there something special about it?
Yeah, there is something special about it. And we actually studied this. We did a thought experiment, not collecting real data, but we did a really robust thought experiment with this a while ago. When the pandemic hit, people were scrambling to work out virtual learning. They were like, oh my gosh, we've got this whole curriculum in person. What do we do? And we ended up doing a lot of what we call learning audits for our larger partners, of just kind of auditing their whole strategy for learning, and just showing them how to put them into hives and how to put them into proper virtual learning. And we did quite a bit of that. We don't really do that now, but it's a thing. But it's kind of coming back because companies are saying, oh, our budgets are being really cut, and we want to keep doing learning, but we're going to have to get away from in person. Right now, probably the ideal combination is hybrid. So some in person, if you can, if it's not too expensive to bring people together, and then follow on with virtual. But our data is really clear that hives are better than in-person workshops. Hives are better than in-person workshops for learning outcomes, right? Not to mention way cheaper, way faster, way more scalable. So anyway, but if you are interested, if you're from a company and you're interested in a learning audit to kind of look at your learning and work out how to save money and make it better, just put learning audit and your company name, and we'll come and talk to you. Just put it in the chat, someone will follow up. So we'll spend an hour with you kind of looking over your whole learning strategy, that's the in-person parts of it, and show you how you could reconstruct it. But it's not a one-to-one. If you've got like a 3-hour classroom, you don't need 3 hours in a hive. And I'll come to your question in a moment, but you got 3 hours in a classroom. Actually, you could do that in 1 or 2 hives. You got a whole day in a classroom, you can actually do that in 3 hives in terms of the habits you're trying to build. But it's not about like taking it and putting it virtual. You actually have to stare at it and look at it and say, what are the actual habits we want people to have? Right. So let's forget how we're doing it in person, right? At the end of the day, if you poll people a month after this, in-person training, what habits are you wanting them to have, and do they have, and matter most, right? And so we'll look at that and we'll say, okay, so what's the most effective way of getting people to have those habits? Let's pick 3 habits. They can be somewhat groups of habits, but let's pick 3 habits. Now let's look at how do we create the strongest insight about that habit in a platform experience. And there are different ways to do that. So we can take a whole classroom day and basically turn it into 3 hives. So we just found a lot of content was like a day, and we found 3 was good. But then to go back to what I started saying, the thought experiment we did was we looked at the number of actions people tend to take after a half day in a classroom, like 3 hours in a classroom. So from our experience, we were running a lot of half-day classroom works. What percentage, like you've got 1,000 people doing a 3-hour classroom, how many actions get taken by those 1,000 people? And we've got a sense of that from the follow-ups, and it's very approximate, but you get, something like 20% of people taking an action, out of 1,000. So you might have 200 actions taken. But then we looked at what happens in a hive if you take that 3 hours and you turn it into 3 1-hour sessions. The fact that you set an action at the end of the first module, and that you tell people you're going to debrief on the second module, that you're going to ask everyone to put in the chat what happened, right? That social pressure takes you from 20% up to like 60, 70, 80, 90%, depending on the cohort, right? Now you multiply that by 2, right? Because you got the 2 spaces between, right? Now you get massive increase in the number of actions people take because of the social pressure. So then maybe the 4th week you have a final activity, like some measurement or some other activity. So it really feels like a month. But we found that most content could be broken into 3 habits. And so what we would do is we'll do habit 1 week 1, habit 2 week 2, habit week 3, and then some follow-up. So it becomes a 30-day experience, but 3 habits. And that space between means between module 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, you're getting a lot of actions taken. And you get, and the number that we came to when we really thought about this for a long time, and we published a piece on this, I'm not sure, maybe it was Fast Company or somewhere. The number we came to was about 7 times the number of habits. So you take a 3-hour classroom, break it into 3 one-hour Zooms over 3 weeks, you should get about 7 times as many actions people take in the real world following up from that. So that's answering the question lots of different ways. We came to it because it was sort of a good structure for a one-day class, and you kind of, people, 3 habits is a good number, and 30 days is a good scale of time for people to think about. So that's how we came to it.
Yeah, that's all great. I mean, I think I love how we're incredibly intentional about what we're putting in. So it isn't that we're just taking all of this content and breaking it up by 3. We're asking what's producing the insights, where can we add social pressure, where can we add reflection? And we had an interesting question about dead air time. And when you're in a virtual class, if you insert some dead air time, what does that do? And is that beneficial? And also, we do this sometimes in some of our long summit sessions, for instance, if anyone ever has attended, we add those digestion breaks we talk about. So what would you say about that, the benefit of that dead air time?
Yeah, it's interesting. So if you just like give people dead air time without any reason, it's problematic. You lose people, right? They're on the computers, right? They're going to go to do something else, like, and it's really quick, like 5 seconds, 10 seconds, definitely, like you've lost people, right? So so you kind of got to hold a bit like a radio host. You're kind of holding attention. You're not just letting people wander off mentally, right? That's important. At the same time, it's really interesting that there is definitely a intentional use of quiet that you want to use, right? Now, last week we were talking about insight. Insight requires no input, right? And then so there's times you're like, and we'll do this in our meetings, we'll do this in learning, we'll share some content, and we'll be really intentional. We'll say, hey, everyone, we're going to all shut up for a minute or 2 minutes. No one's going to talk. I want you to literally get away from your desk and stretch for 1 minute, right? And just let your mind wander, right? Or go for a walk, make a cup of tea. We're back in 2 minutes. Be back in 2 minutes. But let your mind just wander. Don't check your email. Don't check your phone. Yeah, maybe half the people won't check their phone. But come back and let's see what insights you might have about this question, right? So we'll plant a question and we'll let people reflect. And it's super helpful. So you can use that quiet time. It's really powerful. We'll often do that, particularly in in meetings where we're working on a kind of question and a challenge. You get so many better ideas if you actually just leave some quiet. And that's been studied. There's a whole body of research showing brainstorming reduces creativity, the way people do it, because it's just kind of always noisy. But if you let people come up with ideas on their own, you get a lot better quality of insight than trying to come up with ideas as a group, just because of the noise factor.
Yeah, now that just brings me back to this idea of attention, right? You keep saying that we're gauging it, we're getting attention. How do you truly hold attention when you have a group of 30 people? I mean, do we feel that everyone on this call is attending to us? And what are you doing to make sure?
I mean, no, I'm not trying to keep 197 people's focus necessarily, because it's not a learning program, and I don't have permission to do things I would need to do that, right? So as the facilitator, there's a bunch of kind of, we call them 12 golden rules. So there's a bunch of things that really, really make a difference. I mentioned some of them. Some of the sort of hygiene factors is, the group size and on camera and timing and these kinds of things. But it's actually the way that it's actually like the way you ask questions, like, and you sort of ask a question of the group with people knowing that they could be called on, right? So if this was a training right now and I'd covered everything I have covered, I would say something like, I want everyone to think about one implication of ages for the learning that you're, delivering, right? If you're all learning designers, I want you to think about one specific implication of ages that you think you should maybe act on. And I want everyone to think about that. But I'm going to call on 3 people, and you're going to have 30 seconds each to share yours. So just, everyone think about it, right? And then, think about it. And then I'm going to, give you 5 seconds to think, what do you know about ages, blah, blah, blah. All right, now let's call on Bogdan, you're up, right? And so, but then I'd repeat the question to Bogdan because he's a deer in the headlights now from the social pressure. I'd say, all right, here's the question again, right? So you're giving people a chance to win. So everyone's actually imagining it's them. Everyone's actually paying really close attention. So there's a lot of little subtle skills like that. And even in the way you phrase the question, the way you repeat it, a lot of that's very learnable. We trained like lots and lots of facilitators inside companies, like key partners like Microsoft and others, like people have learned how to facilitate like this. And it's such a powerful way. So, holding attention is kind of also, are you doing good storytelling? Are you actually challenging people? There's a sort of principle from comedy and facilitating, which is, use what's there. If something goes wrong, use it, being really real with people, not having a script, right? Not working off a script, but really being dynamic with people. So there's a whole bunch of facilitation skills that kind of keep people with you. And it's an art and a science is the long answer, is the short answer. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. I mean, and with all of that, we've basically put all of our content into a Hive format, into all of our formats. So even our new lead program, right? And anything new that we're working on, such as accountability.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's the fun thing about lead is sort of not about lead. Fun thing about these hives is once you get how to build them, you can get really efficient at building them. It took us a long time, but we started working on accountability because we realized in building lead, which is our foundational leadership program, we realized how important accountability was, and we kind of didn't have a robust framework for accountability. But we thought, let's build some hives. It's going to have us work it out. It's such an interesting construct. It was very woven into our coach program. So we had a framework when you learn to coach of setting actions that really happen and are really helpful. So we had this whole body of thinking around kind of helping your client take on an action that they really own, they really are going to do, and it's really going to help them. There's a bunch of nuance in that that's quite interesting. So we had that work, but we hadn't sort of transitioned that to how does a manager make sure things happen, and how does an individual manage their own accountability. But we realized in breaking it into 3 habits that we could, create a hive, out of this. We're starting to dig into that. I think at the inside, we've got an insiders session. So anyone who's in the insiders community, we're going to actually share this next week, Wednesday, 10 a.m. Eastern next week. If you're not an insider, I think Evan maybe can put a link here. This is for, fairly senior folks in organizations. It's an internal community that we run. So thanks, Evan. So, but if you are interested, if you're from an organization interested in our accountability work, we can run that as 3 hives. Just put the word accountability and your company name in the chat. Someone will follow up. We could run those literally as early as July for you, July, August, and pilot one group and then scale to everyone in your company really, really fast. So that's the beauty of a hive, is once you know the principles, you can sort of take an idea and scale it, pilot it, test it, scale it, and do really, really big things with it.
A really question from Donna is the idea of how do we get buy-in for individuals to show up for session 2 and session 3? Why not just force them to sit into 3 hours all at once?
Yeah. I mean, that's what a lot of companies think. Like, let's just do it in 3 hours because no one will turn up. I mean, you can't do 3 hours of virtual learning. You can't. Your attention just plummets after about an hour and a quarter, hour and a half, because you're really focusing attention the way we do a hive. Sometimes we'll do a 90-minute hive or something 85-minute hive. If it's, people are really bought in, we're doing those more and more actually. But it's generally a 55-minute hive. But you can do an 85, but you can't do a 2-hour or 3-hour hive. It just doesn't work. But there's a bias in that. It's an expedience bias that companies have that, it's just better that way. Look, we don't get 100% of people turning up for module 2 or 3. The percentages vary, but it's actually surprisingly high. And really the only question is, do people get value from module 1? And if people, come to module 1 cynical, which is 99% of people, they come to module 1 cynical and leave with an insight and inspired and like, with an intention to do something differently, and they do something differently and it helps them, they turn up for module 2, right? Like 70, 80, 95% of them. We've had 96% of 4,000 leaders complete all 6 modules of one program, right? 96% of 4,000 leaders complete all 6 modules in one 6-module Hive we did. It's not uncommon for us to get 85 to 95, 96% of an audience completing. But this is non-mandatory, by the way. Never make learning mandatory. We've written on this. When you make learning mandatory, you actually get less habit activation. So you don't make it mandatory, make it compelling. And we've written a lot about that. How you shift from mandatory to compelling is really important. So that's the longer answer to your question, is make it really compelling by connecting it to the bigger structures that you're working on, making it part of everything you're already doing. The language, the way you launch it, all those things really, really matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thinking about how to hold attention for several sessions at a time, we've actually integrated all of this learning into how we design our own yearly conferences, the summit. So we've done the same thing over again and included all of the topics that we're talking about here with all of the experts in the field. So do you want to talk about our upcoming event?
Yeah, this is an interesting thing. So we started live streaming the summit years before the pandemic, like 6 or 7 years before the pandemic. We were running it in New York and LA and different places, but we were streaming just kind of the start and end, the big keynotes, and we had huge audiences for that. And so we sort of got used to this. And then when the pandemic hit, we were like, well, we want to keep running the summit. I mean, we've been running it since 2007 every year. Let's experiment with doing it virtually. And we actually got like 2 or 3 times the number of attendees along. So it was this huge upside in many ways. But we started designing the summit using all these principles. So now you're not having groups of 20 or 30, you might have 100 in a group. So it's not exactly a hive, but there are ways of doing quite large events, like hundreds or even thousands, using these principles, and they're actually really, really engaging. So sometimes we're hired to come in and design a leadership experience and make it virtual. And we actually think you can run better leadership experiences virtual than in person. Of course, you don't get the relationship benefits of like, spending time together. And of course, there's definitely a time and place for coming together. But in terms of like decision-making and strategy development and kind of, working through challenges, you can do that very powerfully virtually if it's well designed. So we do a lot of that. And obviously in the pandemic, we did a lot of that kind of redesigning leadership retreats to be virtual things. So the summit's coming up. We've actually going back to virtual this year. We'll probably be in person again next year. We're going back to virtual, but the upside of virtual is we can have the exact perfect people we want anywhere in the world attending, both as case studies and scientists. So we're going to have an amazing lineup. We're just finalizing that lineup. So the site is a little bit light right now, but we've got some amazing people we can get. Also, you can participate from anywhere. And if you're excited about introducing our work to your broader team, you can invite like your wider team along to the summit. So that's one upside we wouldn't have predicted. So we're getting like whole teams of people attending. So there's now a link. I think Evan can put it in the chat. There's a link. We've just opened up the summit. There's an early bird that finishes at the end of June. Not expensive. You can really participate deeply in 2 days of learning, from anywhere now. So the summit will be virtual, but we're also doing a European version with a European time and an APAC version at an Asia Pacific time. So it's going to be a very international event with crossover and that as well. So I think, putting aside, the Hive, concept directly, these principles can be applied to any kind of virtual synchronous social learning experience, right? Including large conferences, smaller leadership retreats, intense leadership development, specific skills development. If you wanted people to like really get their head around using our new Niles AI, right? You wanted to do, get 1,000 people understanding Niles and really using it. We'll do an amazing set of Hives for you, right? So any kind of learning you can do. Now, technical skills, maybe not as useful. Technical skills, you can do self-service e-learning or create some videos, let people watch them, right? Technical skills is not as important. You don't need the social elements. You don't need the positive pressure. People know they need the skill, right? But social skills, you need the social pressure, you need the overtime, and you can put pretty much anything into a Hive format. So yeah, hopefully this is this has been helpful to kind of prompt your thinking on some of these design issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what we basically provided is a checklist, a blueprint. As you're designing any session, go through and make sure you're designing. It's really designing with the brain in mind, right? That's the point. I mean, you want the best learning. Make sure you're checking these boxes and you're optimizing the learning. Absolutely. You don't have to stuff down so much information. You can really filter for the best information to get the best learning as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just, all the stuff I've been talking about is kind of just in case learning. And maybe I'll finish with this. Just in case learning is fantastic, right? You want people to be better at accountability, safety, inclusion, growth mindset, whatever. We're still doing a huge amount of growth mindset work. It's such an important thing right now. So that's the just in case learning. We think Hives are amazing for just in case learning. Also, our distributed learning solution format scales even more, slightly less effective, but still way more than in person. And then we're now releasing things on our HAP platform, habit activation platform. We think the HAP is going to be very close to the Hive, but we don't have enough data yet. But the HAP is an even more scalable, very digital platform. But for putting aside like just in case learning, the just in time learning strategy we have is our AI tool called Niles. Some of you will have heard of that, a neuro-intelligent leadership enhancing system. That's going into companies this month. So we've basically trained ChatGPT-4 to be a neuro leadership coach. So we've trained ChatGPT to literally like guide you through issues from the context of SCARF and SEEDS and insight and learning and all this stuff. So we put all our content and skills and modules. We're about to start being able to coach you using brain-based coaching. So you can register as an individual, you can apply. We're not opening to individuals yet, but as an individual, you can go to askniles.ai and you can apply, and that'll be open at some point. But we are launching this into companies now. And so it's an immediate use tool. So you're walking to a meeting, there's conflict, you're not sure what you should do. You can literally ask Niles, and Niles will give you an amazing brain-based answer. So if you're interested in talking to someone about Niles from an organization, just put your company name and Niles in the chat and someone will follow up. So I think, speaking of learning, Emma, we should let people get back to things. I'll just say one quick comment on technical skills. I'm sort of repeating it, but technical skills, generally people know they need them. They're sort of self-motivated to learn them. So you can do different learning styles. You can do, e-learning, you can do videos, you can do peer learning, do all sorts of things. Whereas with human skills, any kind of human skills, social skills, you kind of need this social pressure, this pull of something like a Hive or a HAP or something like that. And then one final question, the just in case learning is really most learning that's happening now. Just in time learning or real time learning or learning in the flow of work is literally like, how do you give someone who's having a challenge right at that moment a solution? Right? How do you give a leader who's really stressed walking into a meeting something that'll help them be unstressed right at that moment? How do you and we're even now looking at tools that will read your emails for you and say, hey, this has some this has a safety bias in it. Why don't you think of this? So how do you kind of do that? So we've released a white paper about Niles. And maybe Emma, you could mention how to kind of get a hold of that. But Niles is the first example of something real time that can actually nudge you in the direction of doing things that are more brain friendly for yourself and for others and for whole organizations. So pleasure to share all this with you. Emma, back to you for some closing comments, and then I guess back to Shelby as well. There's a poll that we'll get you to fill in so we know how to help you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, David. This is great. Yeah, so David mentioned the white paper for Niles. We're just finishing that up. So if you'd like access to it, you can put your, white paper and your company name in the chat, and that's being released at the end of this week. And we have a poll up for, anything that we're working on now, if you'd like some help. And I think I'll pass it back over to Shelby. Have a wonderful
Thanks so much, Emma. Great conversation today. Thanks, Shelby, everything, and to the whole team behind the scenes as well. Take care of yourselves. Happy Friday. Bye-bye.
Of course. Of course. Thank you, David. Thanks, Emma, for today's discussion. We appreciate your time as always. As David said, there's a poll up, so let us know how we can help you out. Just a few quick announcements. To reiterate what was said earlier, Summit 2024 is on the way. It will take place October 29th and 30th, and you won't want to miss. It'll be a virtual experience so we can connect with our global communities, and the website is now live. So if you want more information on speakers and to purchase tickets, we do have an early bird special happening now until June 20th, so make sure you get on that. But it's all there for you to see, and we'll drop the link in the chat as well. Also, next Friday, we're going to have a special guest with our team talking about the Workplace Connections Assessment. And so we're really excited for what that conversation is going to be. And we have the registration page live now. So if you want to join us next Friday, hop on that. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, you'll love the podcast. So listen to your brain at work wherever you listen to your shows. And this is where we say farewell. So on behalf of our team behind the scenes and everyone at NLI, thank you so much for joining these, and we will see you back next Friday.